Hello and welcome to Spotlight. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on NATO to launch preventive strikes on Russian soil, drawing a furious response from Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the remarks an appeal to start yet another world war with unpredictable and monstrous consequences. Russian President Vladimir Putin had previously warned the West that Russia would use all available means to respond to threats against its territorial integrity. Moscow says now the need for its operation in Ukraine is highlighted even more. Well, as Putin has accused Western countries of engaging in nuclear blackmail and trying to destroy Russia, a recent report claims that U.S. special forces are on the ground in Ukraine as part of a broad clandestine operation which includes the CIA. Joining us on tonight's Spotlight, we have International Action Center Sara Flounders joining us from New York. And activist and commentator DeBar joining us from OSSINING, New York as well. Well, welcome to the program to the both of you. Let's start off with Ms. Flounders. According to a recent report, U.S. Special Operations Forces are on the ground in Ukraine, citing unnamed U.S. intelligence and military officials. The report says this presence is part of a broad clandestine operation that includes the CIA. What is the purpose of this presence, in your opinion?
Well, this broad CIA Special Forces operation has been going on for years, since the 2014 coup that was orchestrated by the U.S. to overthrow the elected government in Ukraine, and it has been nonstop. U.S. military contractors, trainers, CIA forces, special forces, NATO forces from other countries have been intensely involved in propping up the Ukrainian government, militarizing it start to finish, and shipping in an enormous quantity of weapons, and then trainers in handling those weapons. This has been a big, big operation, and it's all pointed at how to break Russia's relations with the EU through sanctions and military means, and really to utilize Ukrainian forces to do the fighting and dying and the complete destruction of their economy, and also to bring down, it's really brought down the economies of Europe.
DeBar, the report says U.S. clandestine operations inside Ukraine are, quote, now far more extensive than they were early in the war, when U.S. intelligence officials were fearful that Russia would steamroll over the Ukrainian army. Give us your thoughts on this report initially, and is this just what the U.S. and NATO wanted all along, for this conflict to be a prolonged one and to see it dragged out for as long as possible in hopes that it weakens Russia?
Well, certainly the goal of U.S. foreign policy is to not just weaken Russia, but to topple the government and break it into the nation state into several constituent pieces that they can control, so they can loot the natural resources and more or less exploit the human resources as deeply as possible. And if you look around the world for other examples, you can see that that's pretty deep. The resources on the ground were there long before the coup in 2014. Those are the forces that engineered the coup in 2014. Victoria Nuland is, on video bragging shortly after the coup d'etat that they had spent previously $5 billion and essentially preparing for the coup. They had built infrastructure, communications, radio stations, television stations, printing presses, all things that were used to propagandize essentially an ideology that led to the division of the country, exacerbating the existing divisions that you could see on an election map, for example, the 2010 election, to the point where it became violent and the nation state was broken up. The goal of the U.S. in Ukraine has been to position military hardware there, to create chaos where they couldn't dominate it, to terrorize the Russian people with actual Nazis. I mean, The collective memory of Russia of Nazis is of 30 million Russians and other Soviets being killed in World War II. And that if chaos reigns there, fine. If there's an extended war, fine, because the military-industrial complex makes money. It's also, this whole conflict has been weaponized against Europe. Certainly Germany will not rise, and the EU will not rise as against the people who, the construct that belongs to the people who run the United States, since they can't even get gasoline to power their factories. It's a win-win-win for the elite in the United States, and it's a lose for everybody else. We may end up with a nuclear war, and we can talk about that some over the course of this program if you'd like. We may end up with an extended brush fire war like we used to see in Asia back in the 60s. No matter what it is, the elite here thinks that they're going to win. If we end up with a nuclear war, however, that will be shown to be a delusion, and it'll be one, unfortunately, that we will share the consequences of if we don't stop it.
Sara Flounders, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, as we mentioned in the intro, has called on NATO to launch preventive strikes on Russian soil. Those comments drew a furious response from the Kremlin spokesman, who called the remarks an appeal to start yet another world war with unpredictable and monstrous consequences. What is your perspective on the recent comments from the Ukrainian president?
Well, first of all, Ukraine has absolutely no independence. They are just a proxy puppet force for U.S. war plans. And the quotes and statements that they make, really are vetted through the U.S. So it's a new level of threats, an extremely dangerous level of threats. But it is this political force in the Ukraine is a U.S. creation, and it shows a dangerous escalation of one threat after another. Could this lead to wider war? It certainly could. And creating that anxiety and fear is part of U.S. strategy, whether it is the destruction of Nord Stream 1 and 2, or constantly moving more and more forces, higher range of equipment, or in the political statements. So I really see this as a new threat coming from U.S., and they're not doing so well in this war. And so how do they keep upping the ante, and dragging it out, dragging more forces into it, and further, as I say, complete destruction of Ukraine and also of Europe itself. So it's dangerous. And it does show that the U.S. Is more determined than ever to drag this war out and escalate it.
DeBar, Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned the West that Moscow would use all available means to respond to threats against its territorial integrity. How do you read into these warnings, and how seriously should they be taken?
Well, they should be taken very seriously. What's happening, in essence, is a statement for the world to understand of Russia's strategic military policy. On the one hand, the United States is conducting, it's not just a proxy war, as we're learning. There have been U.S. military assets on the ground since 2014 and probably earlier. There was a document signed by Obama enabling military assets to be placed there back when he was president, and this was in 2014. So we're actually at war with Russia. Russia knows it, okay? The Pentagon and Langley know it. The only people who don't know it really are the American people. The statement by President Putin was, in essence, this is the pair of conditions under which we would contemplate or use contemplate the use of or use nuclear weapons. Number one, if they're used against us. Clear enough. That's the mutually assured destruction statement. Number two, if our state is under existential threat. In other words, if someone is going to take down the Russian government, we're going to use all the weapons that we have at our disposal to prevent that. That's why we have a military. Now, the United States claims that that's why it has a military. It has a budget as large as the next 9 countries combined, including Russia, which is three nations down the list from the U.S. And yet, the United States doctrine requires the placement of 800 military bases around the world at Russia's borders, at China's borders, constant drilling and wargaming at the borders of these countries. And so for Russia to say, if you're going to take our government down, as you say you are doing while you are moving military assets around our borders, we're telling you we're not going to allow it to happen. And there's one last point to keep in mind here. Even if Russia allowed what happened in 1991, which is sort of the dream of the people in Langley right now, to happen again, in other words, even if by sanctions and military activity draining the morale of the country and all of that, they were able to effect instability in the government where the government might fall. The Russian government cannot fall this time. The Russian people will not sit for it because they remember the 1990s and they will not go back there. If they force the existing government down in Russia, the Russian people will demand someone more militant and more militaristic to fight a war with the United States. This is a very dangerous game that's being played here.
Sara Flounders, Russia has time and again said countries supplying weapons to Ukraine and training its soldiers were in fact parties to the conflict. The question is, will this support result in this conflict spilling over into other regions and possibly turning into something bigger?
Well, that is certainly the effort, the attempt by the U.S. Wider war, endless military budget, endless military profits in a decaying, dying system that is unable to provide for people's needs right here in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world. So they have every interest in widening the war, in engaging other countries among the states of the former Soviet Union, in threatening China in new and really dangerous ways, and all while continuing the wars in Syria. They still have troops in Iraq, threats on Iran, threats against Cuba, Venezuela. We could just look around the world. The U.S. plan is for wider war, new threats, and creating everywhere they can real instability. Anywhere that economically or militarily they can upend a country, they're all for doing it. And it's a very dangerous policy that creates more and more instability around the world. And yet at the same time, I would say the entire global South has refused to accept the sanctions and is more and more trading and exchanging and connecting with each other in ways that are unprecedented, historically unprecedented. So it is more isolating for the U.S. and its NATO partners than at any time in history before this. It used to be they called the shots. That's how, and they're used to functioning in that way. They would declare a country sanctioned, they would declare that they were taking down a country, and the world stood by. That's not happening in this war, and that is a new development. Now, how the U.S. responds with more threats, more efforts to widen the war, but the cohesion among countries that are refusing to accept this is also growing apace much faster than we have ever seen it. And it's a needed response because every one of these countries now knows they got to cooperate with each other or they will be taken apart.
Mr. DeBar, Volodymyr Zelensky says his forces have retaken some areas in the southern Kherson region. Now, Kherson is one of the areas which was recently declared by Vladimir Putin to be part of Russia. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has promised that these areas recaptured by Kiev will eventually return to Russia. Looking at these developments on the ground, what does this mean overall for the conflict, in your opinion?
People treat war generally, and this war at the moment, as if it were a football contest or some other thing where it's an emotional tug of war that goes back and forth. The United States conducts war lately, say since 1990. You shock and awe, you bomb a place into oblivion, and then as the troops and everybody else escape from the inferno, you pick them off from helicopters and, with mortars and everything else, and you level the place. And then you try to occupy it for 10, 20, 30 years, as in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. And so the end of the football game comes rather quickly. 30 days, 60 days, whatever. In other words, everything's obliterated within a short period of time. And that is mission accomplished. Russia, number one, first of all, isn't conducting this war halfway around the world with people that are strangers that they're trying to dominate. These are their brothers. They were part of the same nation state on and off for the last 500 years. The families live on both sides of those borders in the same way the families live on the borders between New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And so the idea of going in and obliterating Ukraine, which Russia could do with one squadron of planes in an hour and a half, it doesn't occur to them. And further than that, they understand that when this war or whatever this ends up being is over, they're still going to be neighbors. They're still going to have to do business together. They still are going to have families on both sides of the border and all of these things. And so their approach has been something different, and their mission is something different. Their mission was to remove a military threat by the West on their border and to remove this influence that was stoked by the United States over a period from World War II, really, up until and through the coup and to the present, of this Nazi ideology. That looks here like their plan to conquer Ukraine is failing and that they're being reversed. And it's being portrayed that way in the propaganda. But in fact, what's happening is Russia is on game. They're playing chess. They're not playing football. It's a long game. And if you look at a map of the 2010 presidential election in Ukraine and look at a map of the referendum last week or 2 weeks ago in the four republics, you'll see that actually support for joining Russia covers a piece of real estate about 3 times that's been voted on so far. And these little pieces of territory that are being ceded back and forth to avoid major conflicts in populated areas are all full of people that would rather be in Russia than Ukraine. And over time, that's what's going to happen. The question is, how much is the United States going to stoke destruction before that happens? And the real question is, how long are we going to allow this to go on? Because they're spending our money that we need for food, gasoline, medical care, and education at a higher rate than they've spent it on anything in the last 50 years. And we're sitting around fighting over Roe v. Wade and rainbow flags and other things that are important but not nearly as consequential as World War III is going to turn out to be if we let that happen.
Sara Flounders, in light of the recent developments on the ground, how do you view the prospects for an end to this war?
I really think that the U.S. will again and again block every effort of negotiations. However, as we learned from Afghanistan, wars end. And they end by, and they're hard fought, it's at a great loss of life, but where the U.S. can no longer continue with the forces that it has created to continue the war. Now, the Ukrainian military is coming apart. Its losses are enormous. Its losses of equipment is rather spectacular. Even greater than its losses of equipment in war is the amount of equipment that simply gets resold. I mean, the amount of war profiteering that goes on in Ukraine. Huge shipments literally disappear within a mile over the border into Ukraine. There's a huge reselling of equipment and a vast amount of corruption. So the Ukrainian military will come apart and is coming apart. The loss of life is horrendous. But I don't think this war can continue, especially into the winter, regardless of how long the U.S. wants it to continue and is willing to send the trainers. That doesn't mean they will have the army that they hope to have. And they have, the U.S. does keep pumping in, as these recent articles show, special forces, CIA agents, contractors, but they're not the bulk of the army. You need Ukrainian forces for that, and you need equipment and the training to use the equipment, and that is what is coming apart. On the other hand, Russia is more determined than ever before. These areas are now part of Russia, and that changes even the military doctrines. So I don't think this war can continue in Ukraine. Doesn't mean the U.S. will stop at other efforts or that they won't quickly move on to China, Iran, or some part of the former Soviet republics, because they have other plans. But in the Ukraine, I think it will reach its limit in the inability of the Ukrainian military to respond. And we can see that happening now.
And DeBar, one last question for you. We have about a minute left. Why did NATO continue to exist following the collapse of the Soviet Union and at the end of the Cold War? Why? What is the purpose, basically, of NATO today as we speak?
Well, for exactly what you're seeing. The purpose of NATO is to conquer Russia. That it was always that. And what you're going to see happen instead, as they try to induce instability inside Russia and some of the other allies of Russia, what they're actually doing is inducing instability in Europe. And if they don't solve this problem in Ukraine within the next couple of weeks, you may well see revolutions in Germany, France, Italy, and a number of other places, Czech Republic for sure, as a consequence of this adventure. And so, they may think that they are working on Plan A, but Plan B may rear its head and provide a surprise for everyone, October or maybe later surprise.
All right, thanks a lot. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. Allow me to thank my guests from New York, Ms. Sara Flounders from the International Action Center, and also thanks to DeBar, activist and commentator, joining us from OSSINING, New York, and also special thanks to your viewers for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.